Now, the biggest chunk of your CV is probably going to be the work experience and extracurricular section. And I think often students don't really do such a great job conveying the work that they've done and why it was important. So we're going to go through an example of how to actually illustrate to employers that the work you're doing is impactful. Often students have very generic CVs, and that's a problem because it means that we don't know what makes them special as a candidate. Why would you hire that person over another person if you both have very generic CVs? There's no differentiating factor. So it's in your best interest to be as specific as possible when it comes to your CV. When we think about what an employer wants to hire someone who's going to bring results to that company. So your CV should be very results oriented. It doesn't necessarily have to be a number or metric, but a result is something that showcases the impact of your work. So let's go through an example of a generic work experience section and a very specific work experience section. This student worked at a technology company as a software engineer, and I worked on a data science project to measure data accuracy for my team. I was mentored by a data scientist in my team and was taught how to use relevant tools. I presented my results using PowerPoint and Excel to the team during my final week. From reading this work experience, what have we learned? We don't really get too much of an insight into what the student actually did. For example, the student mentions relevant tools, but what exact tools did you use? Or measure data accuracy? What kind of data was used? Why was this data science project important? What were the results? The student mentions results, but what were the results? Mentored by data scientists, but what exactly were the data science roles? What was the context of the project? There's just so much that's left unknown because it's too generic, and this is what you want to avoid. Another student could have this exact same paragraph on their CV, and that's a problem because it means that it's not specific enough. If a student worked at a technology company and they can copy and paste what they wrote in their paragraph and it still makes sense for another technology company, then it's too generic. You need to ensure that your CV is specific. For example, you worked at a fintech company, so financial technology. You'd expect that the work that you did was related to the company, which means that if you were to copy and paste what you wrote on your CV to someone else's, another fintech company, it shouldn't make any sense. So we want to avoid using vague language in our CV. We want to be specific about the work we're doing and why it's important, because as mentioned before, employers want to see results. So they should be able to see the actions that you took led to specific results. So we're going to introduce a framework to actually ensure that you keep on track with building a results-oriented CV. So we follow a technique called the CAR technique, which stands for context, action, result. Context, action, result. Now, the reason this format is really powerful is it streamlines you into telling a story via your work experience. So you set the scene via context. You then tell the employer what you did. So what actions did you take during that experience? And then what was the result of that action? Now, this is really important. It tells the story of how the work you did led to specific impacts. And that's what you want to showcase. You want to showcase that the work that you're doing leads to tangible results. So let's go through this example. So we can tell the student to develop an analytics tool. So we really have some more context into what they're building. What were they doing with the analytics tool? They're comparing data accuracy. So we know it's about data accuracy. What's the context? And this is the context of a financial firm. Why was it important? It was to provide the best execution for clients. So this is a finance term, but what it just means is find the best price for clients. And we can see they worked specifically in the GLL, emerging markets, and precious metal currency pairs. Next, we can see that the student implements an algorithm. So this is what they did. That's an action that they took. So this is context. This is A for action. They implement an algorithm to return the best/worst performing currency pairs for each market and its respective time series graph, given the respective platform. And then instead of saying using programming languages or tools, we can see exactly what they used. They used Python, they used pandas, they used KDB plus Q queries. From the context and the action, we have an idea of them building an analytics tool for that specific problem that they were solving. They then implemented an algorithm. They generated graphs, time series graphs specifically, using these specific technologies. Then what was the result of the action? they deduced the highest performing data provider was 19.2% better. 19.2, this is an example of an impact metric. And what was the result of that? So not only did we get a result, we know why that result was important, because it helped avoid potential switching costs whilst ensuring competitive pricing for clients. You can see how not only have we got a result of the action that was taken, so this algorithm allowed them to make this deduction, and then this deduction helped solve these problems, which then meant that we boost client satisfaction and longevity. Can you see how this level of detail paints a picture, it tells us a story, and this story allows the employer to know that the student actually did something tangible which led to a result. And that's what you need to showcase in your CV. You need to showcase in your CV that you're someone who, you're given a context, you're given a problem, you take specific actions. So not mentioning we, because some people will, if they did a group project, for example, they'll say we. It's not about we, it's about what you did. So what you did specifically, and then what was the result of your actions. And that's how you build a result-oriented CV. Another thing to note as well is if we look at how the sentences start, they start with action verbs. So developed, implemented, deduced. You should start off your sentences using these action verbs. These action verbs help you stay a lot more concise with what you're writing. And you can look online for action verbs to help you when you're writing your CV. So remember, the format is CAR, context, action, results. And you want to follow this format to ensure that when you're documenting your experience in the sections, you tell the employer a story. They can get a full context of what you're doing, why it was important, and what was the result. And that is what's going to help you. But let's say, for example, you don't actually have that much work experience. You might have more extracurriculars. How would you document that on your CV? Let's go through an example. So this is an example of the extracurricular activities and responsibilities section. So you have your organization. So in this context is the Politics and Economic Society, and you have your given role, so you're published. So we follow the same format: context, action, results. So in this case, the context for this student is that they produced research for the school's academic journal, The Olavian Economist, exploring 2019 macroeconomic and demographic trends. And we can see that they've started with a action verb, produce. What action did they take? They conducted analysis on the relationship between the economy and automation after attending Automating the Economy workshop. That's the action that they took. They conducted analysis. So that's action. And then results. The results that they published in the article, and the article was titled The Impact of AI on the Labor Market, and then exploring how automation may increase worker redundancy and increase inequality. So we can see that from our initial premises of exploring 2019 macroeconomic and demographic trends, they've seen how automation may increase worker redundancy and increase inequality from the analysis that they conducted. So we get a full picture. We have the context, we have the action, and then we have the result. So this gives you a great overview of how to actually structure what you're writing in your CV. Again, to reiterate, your experience and your extracurriculars should tell whoever's reading a story, the context, the actions you took, what were the results of that, and why was it important. And then from there, you'll build a